Uh, uh, Good morning. It's a cold morning here in Rochester, and some of us found unexpected ice to scrape. So hopefully we'll be having a few more people coming in. Uh, Today, we're going to hear a presentation, a version of which I heard at St. John's Meadows in the fall, and I thought this would be a good program for us to have here. And I was pleased when Dr. Monica Weiss said she'd be happy to join us. Thomas Merton is a very remarkable person, and if you've read the information that's set out, he was multifaceted and did a lot of growth. Dr. Monica Weiss is, I think, a leading expert on Thomas Merton, and we're fortunate to have her here in Rochester. She is a native Rochesterian, but she's been to school in Colorado, Vermont, Virginia. Thank you. And she's written several books on Thomas Merton. He hasn't been her only interest. She's also done a lot of writing on
Walt Whitman.
Okay, I was thinking, was it Walt Whitman? Yes, and Jane Austen. Right.
Mary Austen.
Mary Austen.
Mary Austen.
Oh, okay.
1901, early American writer.
Okay, and you taught at now Nazareth University, English literature, American literature, effective writing, and I'm not sure what else.
Just about anything.
Okay. So we're going to have some nice visuals along with the content, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. And good morning to those who are up there on Zoom. I think you are very smart not to come out in this cold weather today and the ice and all of that. So I will try to keep remembering that you are there. And it's so nice to have you. I was asked to do something about Thomas Merton and spirituality. And I wanted to do it in a way that might give you a little sense of Merton's life, but also a little model of what we might take for our own growth in spirituality. How many of you are familiar with something with Thomas Merton? And those on Zoom can raise your hand too. Okay, so I thought that I would give you a visual look at his biography by doing landscapes or geographies of different places where he had been in his life. So we have Merton up there, 1915 to 1968. And that's an overview picture of the monastery in Gethsemani, where he spent his last few years. And he was a writer on spirituality, civil rights, peace, nonviolence, indigenous rights, racism, and technology. But probably he's most famous as a 20th century spiritual writer and considered one of the most important 20th centuries, one of the most important 20th century writers. So there are writers that talk about the value of landscape. And up here, Barry Lopez, who died probably within the last 10 years, says that our human imagination is shaped by the architecture it encounters at an early age. So all of you can think about where you grew up, where you first went, and somehow you have already been shaped by that experience. And Scott Russell Sanders, another nature writer, says we need to learn how to become vulnerable to a place, to build intimacy with it. All right, important things. Folks coming in, come on, just right in, take your coats off and settle in. So we have Barry Lopez and Scott Russell Sanders, but we also have Thomas Merton, who says this: every moment and every event of everyone's life on earth plants something in his soul. For just as the wind carries thousands of winged seeds, so each moment brings with it germs of spiritual vitality that come to rest imperceptibly in the minds and wills of us humans. So today we're planting some seeds. Every moment and every event plants something in your soul and my soul today. So let's start quickly with Merton. He begins his life in Prades, France, as the child of painters. We know that painters loved going to the south of France because of the light. It was important. And his spiritual autobiography begins with this sentence: on the last day of January, 1915, under the sign of the water bearer, Aquarius, in the year of a great war, 1915, and down in the shadow of some French mountains on the borders of Spain, I came into the world. That's a great opening sentence for an autobiography. But that's Prades, France, and it is dominated by the Canigou, the mountain called Canigou. You see it there looming over the village that's there. And if you look at the picture in the lower left, I want you just to look at the shadows. I took that from my apartment window. Do you see, first of all, the skinny little narrow street, but also the way the light moves. And that area is referred to, I suppose, as a chiaroscuro world, very much light and dark. Maybe not surprisingly, the first sentence or word that little Thomas Merton had, at least that his mother recorded in the baby book for the grandparents who lived in New Zealand, was the word color. That's, I think, important. The next thing with Prades, France, was the river Tet that comes burbling down from the Canigou mountain, making lots of noise. And his mother says in the baby book that whenever she took little Merton over the bridge near the water, he stood up in his pram, okay, early word, and was trying to gaze at that water. I said, I need to find that. So I went to look for the River Tet, and when I was on that bridge, probably a block before I saw the river, I heard it gurgling. So imagine it rushing all the way down from that mountain, causing that. And we know that Thomas Merton was a precocious little guy. So imagine him standing up in that carriage, trying to see the mount, trying to see the gurgling river. And there it is. Now, much later in his life, he wrote an essay about rain, about water, called Rain and the Rhinoceros. And in it, he says this, and I think it relates back to his childhood experience with that burbling water. He says, what a thing it is to sit absolutely alone in the forest at night, cherished by this wonderful, unintelligible, perfectly innocent speech, the most comforting speech in the world, the speech of the rain. The talk that rain makes by itself all over the ridges, and the talk of the water courses everywhere in the hollows. Nobody started it. Nobody's going to stop it. It will talk as long as it wants, this rain. And as long as it talks, I'm going to listen. I think there's a connection with his childhood experience. Now, the war came along in World War I. His parents returned to the States with the relatives in Long Island. A few years later, now both of them were painters, but his father, Owen Merton was a serious landscape painter. He went back to France to an area called St. Antonin when little Merton was 10 years old. He took the little boy with him, and this is an area of St. Antonin, and Merton was kind of left on his own because his dad was out painting, but he was taken with what he called the labyrinth of narrow streets. Now, this is a little kid who comes from no religious upbringing. His mother, if anything, was leaning toward Quakers and said, well, eventually he'll figure it out. So he doesn't have much spiritual training, as some of us might have had from our childhood, but he discovers a first sense of belonging in this area of St. Antonin, and noticed that all of the streets led to the cathedral in the center of the village, and says this: "The landscape forced me to live as a virtual contemplative." It's a 10-year-old kid. Now, this is a 27-year-old man reflecting on being a 10-year-old kid. But there was something that touched him about that landscape. In the summer, while his dad was still painting, he was free, little Merton was free to run in the mountains and the hills in the area. His dad farmed him out to a family that was willing to take care of him for the summer. And he would see the mountains, the areas of the monasteries in the area, and just was loving it with that freedom. So he eventually goes to England, where there were some relatives, to the school of Oakham. And Oakham is still in existence and supports Thomas Merton Festival every couple of years. And little Merton, liked to go out beyond the school grounds to an area called Brook Hill. And he was searching for a place of solitude and interaction with the landscape. And he says this: "I like to be alone on the top of Brook Hill and not have to talk to anyone. I would walk or sit up there for hours, not waiting for anything or looking for anything or expecting anything, but simply looking out over the wide valley and watching the changes of the light across the hills. Most of the time, I just went up there, to walk around, and to think." I think he's having an experience of primitive meditating or contemplation, and there's something happening to his spirituality at that time. After his time at Oakham, he gets a scholarship to go to Clare College in Cambridge for 1 year. But we know that sometimes first-year college kids get into trouble and that freedom is a little too much to handle. And so he's, let's say, excused from the college and called back home to the States by his guardian, because by this time, both his mother and his dad have passed away. His mother when Merton was 6 years old, and his dad when he was about 15. So at Columbia University, is this kid kind of, drifting around? What's he going to do? Meets some lifelong friends, about 6 of them. One of them being Bob Lax, and Merton is being the cartoonist for the humor magazine at Columbia. He's studying English, thinks he wants to go and do a PhD on Jared Manley Hopkins, but he manages to get his master's degree. And during the summer, Bob Lax's family owns a cottage in Olean, New York, practically neighbors to us. And so these guys go to the cottage in the summertime so they can listen to jazz, drink beer, and write the great American novel. So this is their escape. But how important it is when Merton comes into that area on the train, what a change from New York City that was, because they used to spend their time down at the jazz clubs and drinking beer. So he says in his autobiography, "For the first time, I saw a part of the world in which I was one day going to learn how to be happy. Those deep valleys and miles of high, rolling, wooded hills, and the color. Ooh, there's that word, the color, and the freshness and the bigness and the richness of the land. When we got out of the train at Olean, we breathed its air and listened to its silence. It's a second look at the area in Olean. Now, because of his connection to that area and because of Bob Lax, after Merton got his master's degree, Bob Lax got him a job at St. Bonaventure, now university, where he taught English for 3 semesters. And when he was at St. Bonaventure's, he had already converted to Roman Catholicism. That happened in New York City. And he used to say the office, the divine office, or the liturgy of the hours in that area. And there's a look at the campus of St. Bonaventure. And he talks about, again, the hills and the influence that they had on his life. And then he says, snow comes early to St. Bonaventure. We know that. I used to say the little hours of the breviary, walking in the deep, untrodden drifts along the wood's edge toward the river. No one would ever come and disturb me out there in all that silence under the trees, which made a noiseless, rudimentary church over my head, between me and the sky. So he really feels content and secure and embraced by that scenery. And he says this, "Oh, America, how I began to love your country." He's French by citizenship, by birth. And it's only some years later, after he enters the monastery, that he actually becomes a United States citizen. What miles of silences God has made in you for contemplation. If only people realized what all your mountains and forests are really for. There's a whole interesting spiritual insight happening within him by being alone in the woods and in the snow and praying and feeling that contemplation calling to him. Now, it's that calling to him. One of his professors at Columbia invited him to go down to Gethsemane, Kentucky, to make a retreat on Holy Week. And so he says, okay, he'll go. He takes the train down to Louisville and then a taxi out to the area. And he says, I looked at the rolling country and at the pale ribbon of road in front of us, stretching out as gray as lead in the light of the moon. And then suddenly I saw a steeple that shone like silver in the moonlight, growing into sight from behind a rounded knoll. The trees sang on the empty road, and breathless, I looked at the monastery that was revealed before me as we came over the rise, and over all the valley smiled the mild, gentle Easter moon, the full moon in her kindness, loving the silent place. So Merton spent a weekend at that Trappist monastery and was taken with the rigor of the monastery, with the discipline of the monastery, with the whole place of it. And then he has to go back to St. Bonaventure's and teach those squirrely kids. And I'm sure it was the second history of literature, English literature, that students have to take, that he was teaching. So when he goes back to St. Bonaventure's, he's really caught. He's being attracted to the monastery, the place, the silence, the discipline, and he's struggling with it. And one night when he is out near the shrine of St. Teresa, in his imagination, he hears the bell of the monastery calling him home. So that's a huge moment of spiritual insight for him. So he winds up his duties at St. Bonaventure's, and in December of 1941, he enters the monastery. While he's there, he is just like us, citizens of a dualistic world that see light as good and dark as bad. You know, we come from that enlightenment of several centuries ago, and Merton has to discover the unity, the oneness, the wholeness of everything, which is something that lots of us struggle with, and we have moments of being good at it. But he says this, one night he's looking out the dining room window at an area that he's not seen before. And he says, I saw the country in a light that we usually do not see. The low slanting rays picked out the foliage of the trees and highlighted a new wheat field against the dark curtain of woods in the knobs that were in shadow. It was very beautiful, deep peace. Sheep on the slopes behind the sheep barn. I looked at all this in great tranquility with my soul and spirit quiet. For me, here's the key line. For me, landscape seems to be important for contemplation. Anyway, I have no scruples about loving it. There's this spiritual insight that everything in the universe is interconnected, is one. We say that phrase so easily now in the 21st century and try to live out of it. He, in the late 1940s, is discovering it in his soul. The abbot of the monastery realizes that Merton is a special person and gives him permission to go beyond the cloister area of the monastery to pray and to wander in the area. And so in June of 1949, he's allowed to spend some of his free time out there. And when I read his journals, it's rhapsodic prose that goes on for several pages. He's just, the new freedom, the new spiritual freedom is just something. And he's master of novices at that time, so he has to teach them classes. And so he says to them, Gethsemane looked beautiful from the hill. It made much more sense in its surroundings. We do not realize our own setting, and we ought to. It's important to know where we are put on the face of this earth. Think about where you are now, okay? And Merton also says we need to feel the spring. I know you feel it already today in your heart. It hasn't happened yet, but he has a developing sense of response and responsibility, and he's convinced that our mission is to feel the spring. The earth cannot feel all of this. We must. But living away from the earth and the trees, we fail them. We're absent from the wedding feast. Now, if you ever wanted an ecological statement, there it is, all right? So there's another spiritual insight coming to him. But not everything happens just in nature, in the woods. Merton had to go into Louisville sometimes for appointments. And those of you that know Merton and know the area there's the famous episode or spiritual insight that takes place at 4th and Walnut down in Louisville. He was crossing the street and it's noontime and everybody's busy going back and forth. And he has a realization how, again, humans are interdependent with each other. And he says, and there's a plaque there that commemorates 4th and Walnut. He was overwhelmed with the realization that he was related to these people. He was not just in the monastery to escape from human troubles, that he was related to them and that he loved all these people. And at the center of our being is a point of nothingness, a point of true truth and spark, pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. The spark is in everybody. And if only everyone could see that they are walking around shining like the sun. That's us here in this room, and you folks on Zoom up there. Every one of us is walking around shining like the sun because of that inner divine spark. So open your eyes and think about it. Now, Merton also liked to be alone and was looking for a hermitage of some kind on the monastery grounds. And there are two rudimentary places where he was given permission to spend some time in prayer. The first is the Red Trailer. Now, it was not in that decay state when Merton was there, but it was something left over from a construction of one of the buildings there. And that photo is from some 50 years after Merton learned it, and it's just there in the woods. But there was a tool shed nearby that Merton named St. Anne's, where he used to go to pray and to meditate. And on one of the occasions, he was looking out at the area and praying and saw that there was a group of birds, starlings, that were feeding, and suddenly they all flew because there was a predator in the area. And the starlings came back, and suddenly, straight as an arrow, he says, the hawk came down and killed the slowest starling, and then went over to a tree and was doing what hawks do, keeping the balance of nature. And he says, I tried to pray afterward, and I thought of that flight coming down like a bullet from the sky behind me. I think that hawk is to be studied by saints and contemplatives because he knows his business. Now at Nazareth University, we have some hawks that come annually to nest, and we can watch them training the fledglings of how to hunt. And there are places where they've got to do it, and they've got to do it again and again and again to learn that skill. And Merton says, I wish I knew my business as well as he does his. I'm going back to the attic, meaning that little garden shed, and the shovels, and the broken window, and the trains in the valley, and the prayer of Jesus. Practice, practice. Now, the prayer of Jesus from the Orthodox Church, Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. Inhale and exhale. But he says he's going to practice. He learned that from the hawk, who was able to catch the prey because it had practiced. That's an important lesson, I think, for each of us. It is for me, but it's a wonderful spiritual insight. So later, Merton is able to live in a hermitage, which was meant to be built as an ecumenical center, but he had his eye on it, and he said, and was given permission to spend some time there. And he says this in his journal: a cool and lovely morning, clear sky, every changing freshness of woods and valley. One has to be in the same place every day, watch the dawn from the same house, hear the same birds wake each morning, to realize how inexhaustibly rich and different is the sameness. This is the blessing of stability, and I think it is not evident until you enjoy it alone in a hermitage. Now, Merton would come down to the main monastery daily to participate in local mass or to get food and water for the hermitage. And one morning he comes down with, and I want to show you this picture that's taken without any photographic filters from a friend of mine. the myriad stars in Kentucky. He comes down and says, it was simply that. I was that. In the morning, seeing the multitude of stars above the bare branches of the wood, I was suddenly hit with the whole package of meaning of everything, that the immense mercy of God was upon me, and that the Lord in infinite kindness had looked down on me and given me this vocation out of love. Think for a minute of moments that you've had of being out looking at the stars and having some realization of the cosmic meaning of things. And I see people nodding heads. I don't know if anyone on Zoom is nodding a head. I can't see that, but there are ways in which we have these moments. So I have a question of why was Merton able to have these spiritual insights and so much. And I think it's because of his particular power to live on the margins. Now, what I mean by that is that he was able to see better and more deeply. Ecological folks refer to the ecotone, which is the edge between, let's say, trees and bushes and flatland. That if you go into the unknown, it's both a positive and a negative. You have more opportunity for food, but also you have more opportunity to become the prey for some predator. The ecotone is the edge, and it's both dangerous and also beneficial. And I think Merton was able to do that. He was able to live inside the monastery, in the community, and apart in the hermitage. He was committed to silence and solitude, and yet he had compassion for the world with his writing. He was a bystander by choice, and yet he was a participant in the dialogue of the 60s on war, racism, and technology. He was a monk of the Western tradition, and yet he studied Eastern thought, especially Zen. He was practical. He was clearing brush out there by the hermitage, cutting trees, and yet he was a contemplative. He could sit quiet in the woods. He was trained in Lectio Divina, which is a way of meditating on the scriptures, and yet he was able to read the scripture of nature. He could write eloquently of nature, and yet he could embrace the prosaic ritual of going to the outhouse and looking for the king snake that was in there and would open the door and say, "Are you in here, you bastard?" So Merton was able to do that on the ecotone. So what about you? How has landscape imprinted itself on your writing, your thinking, your attitudes? And looking at the trajectory of your life, what landscape becomes most important? I'll give you a minute just to think about that, because it's one thing for me to say Merton landscape geography. You just reflect for a minute. And if anybody wants to share, feel free. Nancy. Oh, we have microphone too.
Thank you. My family has a farm that has been in our family for 175 years. And there's a hill, a geologic formation, a great big hill in the backyard. And it has been, whenever anybody in our family visits the farm, they go up on the hill.
Mm.
And it also has been the place that we have spread ashes of our beloveds. And we always, I do the funerals, and I always read, "I lift my eyes to the hill from whence cometh my strength."
See how you are connecting scripture and the scripture of nature and what this does for your family, how precious and sacred that space is. and you somehow just discovered it. That's great. Thanks. Anybody else want to offer something? Sure. Thank you.
I'm trying to think of how many years ago it was, about 45 years ago. Bob and I purchased 10 acres of land in the Finger Lakes, and we call it our retreat because I don't like the idea that we own this land because it's really not our land. But anyway, so I call it our retreat. But again, the hills, it's in the hills and the valleys up above Cayuga Lake. And I always think of the scripture again, be still and know that I am God.
Be still.
And as you hear
and
the
I am
wind,
God.
and as you talked about Merton and the
Mhm,
silence,
mhm.
Bob will sometimes say, what do you hear? And it's the wind or a bird or oftentimes the frogs or, some bird, and mostly it's silence. Yeah. Yeah.
And you can add to that, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am.
Mm-hmm.
Be still and know. Be still. Be. It's a good way to stay with that. Now, thank you. Yes.
And on
Carol.
our chat from Marie and Peg,
Oh, Chad. Oh, good. Thank you.
they described the landscape of the Naples Hills where Peg grew up.
Great. Thank you for catching that. Notice how it seems to be nature and hills landscape, but it can also be Fourth and Walnut moments when you realize the inner spirit you want to share.
Yes, I just wanted to add my urban experience
Good.
because I lived in the city of Rochester for 20 years in a very small house, and we moved to a bigger one, but we still have the old one because we can't let go of it. We love it so much. It was too small for us, but now that we've moved out, it's like a little studio that both of us can go to for just a little peace and quiet. And we just remember, when we lived there. So it has all the love, all the pets, the memories of our pets running around. And I thought, well, of course we'll sell it immediately, right? But we don't even want to rent it because then people would come into our place.
Understandable. You have your own hermitage. Yes, you do, just like Merton. Now, I want to say to you, yes, go ahead. I don't want to shut anybody off. Go ahead.
This morning, I was struck by a poem by Mary Oliver that came on Facebook. And part of the words, if I get to the right ones here, just a moment. Okay, here it is. And have you been trudging like that, sometimes almost forgetting how wonderful, how wondrous the world is, and how miraculously kind people can be?
Miraculously
Kind
people
people
be.
can be.
That's
Words that I'm hoping to keep with me as we go forward in this chaotic world, chaotic situation where the rest of the world seems to be coming apart. Remembering that nature is still there, and
we are there.
and we are there, and as wondrous as always. And my place is our cottage on Canandaigua Lake, and particularly it's on a cliff, so looking from the house out on the lake and the hills and the water.
Now, I want to say to you, you are all mystics, and you laugh. You laugh. All right, but here's a quote from Sister of St. Joseph, Joan Roccaselvo. Mystics, meaning people of prayer, meaning you and me, okay, are incarnational people in tune with the earthly as well as with the otherworldly. They, meaning you, can find and touch God anywhere, in and through daily occurrences, as well as in prayer. You are alive in God.
I have one other to offer
From the chat?
chat?
Mhm.
From Marie and Peg. From my back porch where I watch the birds and squirrels eat.
On the back porch. One time I gave a talk, something like this, and one of the women shared that she is in a wheelchair and confined to her bedroom or a room. And she looks out that window, and that's her view of reality. But she watches that window outside and how the whole world comes by. It's reality for her. So it's very similar there about watching what's happening with the birds and the squirrels because you are mystics. Bob, are you wanting to say something?
Here.
This was back.
That's all right.
Place. Well, I was thinking
Hold the
about,
mic up.
I was thinking about Firth and Walnut
Yes.
and my experience on the bus
Mm.
when I am with so many people I've never seen before and probably will never see again. And yet I love going on the bus because I feel the oneness of us all. And it's quite remarkable to see the beauty in the people who were there who come from mostly having worked all day long
Mhm.
or being on their way to work. Who knows how long they had to walk to get to the bus. And yet they're laughing and sharing with one another. And that's always
Oh, that's wonderful.
think
That
about.
bus becomes your hermitage, your little place to see the spark of light in each person. So you are now what? Commissioned as mystics to continue to be thinking and looking and in the process of being kind, as Mary Oliver reminds us, to be looking to see what's to be seen. Now, here's the beginning of New Seeds of Contemplation, in which Merton says, contemplation is life itself. It's not away someplace in a monastery only. It's life itself, fully awake, fully alive, fully aware that it is alive. It is spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life and of being. So that whole notion of abiding in a place, as he suggests, has a significance. And this deepening habit of awareness helped Merton write in a little book, Thoughts in Solitude, which he wrote in that attic hermitage area of St. Anne's, that funny little tool shed. He wrote this: everything I touch is turned into prayer. Where the sky is my prayer, the birds are my prayer, the wind in the trees is my prayer, for God is all in all. Just let that deepen. And later he writes, it's a strange awakening to find the sky inside you and beneath you and above you and all around you, so that your spirit is one with the sky and all is positive night. So finding the sky within you, that goes back to the little spark. So you're commissioned as mystics. You've got a big job to do today and tomorrow. And I hope I was able to give you a little bit of understanding about the biographical data of Thomas Merton, and also something about the developing spirituality that allowed him not just to pray alone, but to reach out to Jewish community, to the Islamic community, to the Zen community. He was very interested in interreligious dialogue and in the social justice elements of our world, because you cannot have compassion in yourself unless it spills out into others. And so that's going. So as committed mystics, now you are commissioned. On the side table in the back there, I left some handouts if you wish. One is a chronology of Merton's life that gives you the names of all the books that he wrote, and so you can pursue whatever you wish with that. There's a yellow paper that has some of his poetry on it you may want to use for your own prayer. And the green paper has some nature quotes from Merton that you could use. And I also, because I was ordering it for another conference that I'm going to, there's some information about the International Thomas Merton Society and a prayer card of his famous poem about, I do not know where I am going, but I believe that God is leading me. So you're welcome to that. And there's also a picture there of Merton. So thank you for your attention this morning. And we do have 5 minutes or so for Q&A. So now that I told you the little housekeeping things there, and I will join you for worship this morning, but we have some time for Q&A. So yes,
Okay,
go ahead.
I'm going to ask a question first. I'm wondering how much contact he had within the Louisville community. I was there on a Quaker project back in the early 60s, and people, the group had gone to Bardstown. We tried to see him in person, but of course we're not allowed admission beyond the entrance. But it was the first segregated town in the South to segregate peacefully, and Quakers and others in the city were very much involved in that process. And I don't know if there was any integrate peacefully. Yes, did I say segregate? No, that had happened earlier. Sorry about that. And I'm just wondering, if there was any connection between experiences he had in Louisville.
He went into Louisville often for doctor's appointments, and he would always manage, because he was always very clever at managing time, would go to libraries and inhale magazines and books and stuff, and was writing for books. So he was reading widely, very taken with the Shaker community that was nearby, which is close to Quakerism, and always thought that their notion of simplicity and their architectural design needed to be replicated in our own lives. Get rid of all that extra stuff that we have, that they understood what was the essence of life. So yeah, there was definitely some connection.
I was just curious, going to ask if you know, how is it that his writings, kind of tucked off in a hermitage, found their way to publication and to the world, to the point that you are sharing all these writings? Thank you very much, by the way, for what you were sharing. But it seems kind of miraculous that he was writing there and somehow the world knows about him.
And that he had 2 hours to write each day, because he was always going to chapel at the right times to sing the office. So how he managed, first of all, he was trained at Columbia in English and journalism. So when he had time to write, he was writing, knew how to do it. When he put out his autobiography in 1948, it was picked up by Bob Giroux at what's that? Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and Bob Giroux became advocate for him for his writings. And then over at New Directions also, who published some of his poetry. So he had some, let's say, agents on the outside, so that any time that he had something, his first agent was Naomi Burton Stone, who worked, I think, for Farrar, Straus and Giroux. So she became an advocate for him. Now, Bob Giroux has died about within the last 5 years or so, but he was one of the major movers and shakers for that. So the fact that The Seven-Story Mountain, which is his autobiography, became a hit over the first couple years. Now, this is a man, I say to students, here's a 27-year-old man writing his autobiography. What 27-year-old man do you know has anything worthwhile saying? And there it is. It has never been out of print. It has been, you can find it at almost any bookstore because it's there and people are still reading it. And as with others of his books too. Yeah, Nancy.
Copies of the book at the Monroe County Library.
Oh, really? A waiting line for them. Okay, so we're on a Merton revival. But that's how it started. And the fact that he was saying things in the early 60s, he was way ahead of his times, talking about indigenous rights in the early 60s, talking about nonviolence, talking about the dangers of technology. AI would have blown him away with that, and talking about the dangers of war. He has an essay that the root of war is fear. He also had ability to put some essays in the Catholic Worker journal that came out at that time. So he had feelers out there. Now, yes, he was in a monastery, but people would come to visit him and he would get permission to see them. So anytime he was out, he was always, again, making waves. And then some of his essays. Ramparts magazine from several generations ago published his stuff. So, he was out there on the cutting edge of the intellectual community. Did that answer? Okay. Yes, David.
Thank you so much for your scholarship and your spirituality. Marie and Peg actually have a question that I think we're all interested in. Can you share a little bit of your own spiritual experiences?
My own spiritual experiences. I think related to my education, I did not want to do graduate work. I entered the Sisters of St. Joseph in 1960, a few years ago, and I did not want to become parochial and too inbound. So when it was time to do graduate work, I said, gotta go someplace. I think I have gypsy feet. So I did work in Colorado and got into mountain climbing out there on the weekends. Wish I could do it again, but can't. Got into Vermont to Middlebury, and again got into a group of friends at graduate school that still connect with me. And so it's the people that challenge me to be who I say I think I am or am trying to be. Did graduate work at the University of Virginia, which was a painful experience. They didn't want older women coming down there who needed to prove themselves that they could get an A in every course, and if not, just go away. The English department was particularly nasty, and hoping that you could discover that you couldn't cut the mustard and would go away of your own. So kind of things like that. Loved my teaching for 40 years at Nazareth University. Those are all extra things. They're activities. But as a sister of St. Joseph, I'm committed to private prayer and communal prayer. And so those experiences, I think, challenged me. And maybe that's the best way of saying about spirituality, is being challenged by other people and being challenged by the impression that other people have on you, and by the intensity of their life and their commitment. And they say, okay, what about little Monica? What am I doing? Challenged by my friends also. Does that help?
I have another question though. Pat, do you want to go? So he was not raised in a religious
No. Mm-mm.
family, and then he became Roman Catholic first.
Mhm.
How did that transition happen?
His friends were mostly Jewish, the bunch at Columbia that he was hanging around with. He was reading Huxley's The Ends and Means. He was reading the biography of Jared Manley Hopkins, who became a Roman Catholic and a Jesuit. And he thought, well, I could maybe do that too. And so he went down to Corpus Christi Church in Manhattan and found a priest there, Father Ford, I think was his name, and said, I want to take instructions. And his Jewish friends pushed him in the right way to say, you need to do that. And Bob Lax particularly, who was a poet in his later life and lived on the island of Patmos in Greece, said to him, if you're going to do this, you need to become a saint. In other words, you got to do it, and you got to do it all the way. So I think that's sort of how that happened. Yeah, he was feeling drawn. And then the invitation to go to Gethsemane for a retreat. It's like, whoa, that's where I belong. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just thinking in his lifetime, when he was only 18 years old, that
Mm.
was when Hitler came to power, and he was in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And then towards the end of his life, he's in a monastery, and a women's movement is arising in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And possibly people, I mean, I think people were starting to leave, stop being nuns and
Mhm,
priests and
mhm,
all of
mhm.
that. Did he have commentary about the Catholic Church and the direction
Oh,
it
yeah.
was taking?
Yeah, he was very happy with Vatican II, 1962-63, and the changes and the idea of the church being the people of God, not the church being the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops, not that hierarchical. He had trouble with moving toward the English liturgy, though, because he loved the rhythm and the melody of the Latin language. So liturgy was a little edgy about that. But all of the social issues that were coming forth, he had some correspondence with Joan Baez, who came down to the monastery when she was very involved in some of the peace movements. And people would say to him, or they would ask him, should he be joining the peace movements? Should he be coming out and joining them? And he was feeling maybe he should. And they said, no, you stay there. You need to be there, and your prayer life is the backdrop that allows us to be activists. Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else? Almost time to go to church, folks.
Yes, I had just a quick comment. In the days before the internet, when information wasn't as available as it is right now, I applied to the University of Virginia,
Mm.
and I had an uncle who was a Supreme Court judge in Virginia who wrote a recommendation for me and all of that. And the response was essentially, sorry, no girls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were not great on the females, unless you could be useful to them in some way. We won't go into that discussion. All right, Bob, thank you very much for coordinating this morning. And
Thank
thank
you
you for
so
coming.
much.
Nice to have you.
Um,
And thank you, Zoom members.
I find all of us wishing,
You're okay.
oh, I'm sorry for my viewing public. Um, Don't we wish we were students in her classes? Thank you so much. And I've just found all kinds of reverberations in my psyche, I guess, with all these things. Gosh, thank you so
You're
much.
very welcome. We can all be challenged a little bit more today and think about our own developing spirituality. So thank you for coming, participating.
And don't forget, next week we hear Gail Mott's spiritual journey. So.
Okay. And I didn't even drink